A very good morning to the esteemed examiners and my fellow friends. Today, our group will be discussing on the Edgar Allan Poe's short story, which is The Telltale Heart, and explaining why the narrator ultimately confesses to his murder of the old man. In my opinion, I think the primary cause why the narrator confesses his wrongdoings is due to his fear of being discovered. Throughout his whole journey, the narrator perfectly curated the storyline by manipulating the audience, including himself, about his confidence and boldness. It is as if the narrator is paranoid, as he is hiding a major truth from the audience and also himself and with the police. This creates a mental pressure that led to the confession, as it creates an emotional restraint where he feels burdened and feels the urge to confess. For instance, in the story, even though the police officers were sitting calmly and smiling with the narrator and having a nice chit-chat, the narrator becomes convinced that they were mocking him and already know the truth. This irrational fear makes him feel completely exposed, driving his paranoia to the point where staying silent feels worse than confessing. This can be correlated to the similar guilt a child could hold and bottle up when they are hiding something from their parents and having the overwhelming fear of being discovered by their parents. Therefore, this terrifying fear of being caught is the primary source and cause that forces his confession. What do you guys think?
So thank you, Trishna. I truly agree with Trishna's opinions because fear of being discovered can make the narrator panic and pushing him towards confessions. From my perspective, I think imagined heartbeat is one of the strongest reasons why the narrator finally confesses to kill the old man. Firstly, the imagined heartbeat shows the narrator guilty conscience, even though he thinks he has committed the perfect crime by hiding the old man's dead body under the floorboards, but he cannot escape the mental effects of what he has done. Because of this, his mind starts to create sounds that are not real. For example, while the police officers are calmly talking to him, the narrator suddenly hears the old man's heartbeats. At first, the sound is quiet, but it becomes louder and louder as the conversation continues. Since the old man is dead, the heartbeat cannot be real. It is something the narrator imagined because of his guilt and unstable mind. So at the end of the story, when the narrator can no longer stand the loud beating, he becomes very nervous, lose control of his feeling, and finally he then admits that the old man's dead body is hidden under the floorboards. In conclusion, I believe the imagined heartbeat is the strongest reason for the narrator's confession because it is the final trigger that makes him break down. So what do you guys think?
I strongly agree with you. The imagined heartbeat affected the narrator's mental state and caused him to lose control. However, I would like to add another point, which is that the narrator finally confesses because of the pressure from the police. This is because the presence of the police creates psychological pressure that affects the narrator's ability to control his emotions. Even though the police do not have any direct evidence against him, their investigation makes him feel anxious and afraid that his crime will eventually be discovered. In the story, the police visit the narrator's house and continue investigating the old man's disappearance. This evidence is important because it shows that the narrator is unable to escape from the situation and the pressure continues to build up in his mind. As a result, the narrator becomes more nervous and loses his confidence in hiding the murder. The pressure from the police causes him to panic and finally admit his crime. For example, in real life situations, a person who hides a mistake may confess when they feel intense pressure from authorities or when they believe they are close to being exposed. Similarly, the narrator could no longer maintain his act of innocence when faced with the police. Therefore, I believe that pressure from the police was a significant factor that pushed the narrator to confess. Do you agree with my point?
Yes, I totally agree with what Speaker 3 has to say. The pressure from the police greatly affects how the narrator decides to confess his crime. Today I'd like to talk about the theme of loss of emotional control in the Edgar Poe's Telltale Heart. The story shows that when a person loses emotional control, fear, obsession, and guilt can overpower their thinking and lead to destructive actions. Throughout the story, the narrator's inability to control his emotion causes him to become obsessed with the old man's so-called vulture eye. Although he insists that he is sane, his fear and anxiety grow stronger day by day, which acts as a catalyst for him to make decisions that is not exactly acceptable by society. Later, his overwhelming guilt makes him imagine hearing the dead man's heartbeat. Unable to control his emotions, he breaks down and confesses the crime to the police. This proves that emotional instability in a person can cloud judgment and ultimately destroy a person's skill of thinking rationally. In conclusion, the Telltale Heart teaches us that losing control over our emotions can lead to irrational decisions and serious consequences.
I completely agree with speaker number 4, as the loss of emotional control can also be a contributing factor to the narrator's confession. It is indeed a psychological fact where a person could feel emotionally restrained from surpassing all the guilt and fear within themselves and eventually reaching a breaking point where they have to expose themselves and feel relieved. Upon that, I can also agree that from the perspective where the narrator confesses due to the overwhelming sense of guilt. When someone commits a terrible act, they will feel morally wrong and eventually to the extent where it feels difficult to suppress it. For instance, in the text, he describes a dull and low sound ringing in his ears that grows louder and louder eventually while he sits with the police, who were actually calm and friendly with him, which is his own guilt tormenting him. Do you guys agree with me?
So I truly believe that overwhelming guilt is also one of the crucial reasons why the narrator confesses, because he cannot escape his guilty after killing the old man. Although he hides the body successfully, the guilt continues to affect his mind and emotions. For example, the narrator starts hearing the old man's heartbeat even though the old man is already dead. This shows that his guilt creates a psychological burden that he cannot control. In the end, his guilt becomes too painful, causing him to lose control and admit the murder. Therefore, I think overwhelming guilt pushes him to reveal the truth too.
I totally agree with you. This is because after committing the murder, he could not escape from his guilt conscience and the guilt continued to disturb his mind. For instance, he became increasingly anxious and unable to control his emotions even though the police had no solid evidence against him. Therefore, his guilt eventually pushed him to reveal the truth. Do you agree with my point?
I totally agree with what Speaker 3 has to say, and to add to the point, in The Telltale Heart, overwhelming guilt is shown through the narrator's inability to escape his own consciousness after murdering the old man. Although he believes he has committed the perfect crime and has curated it perfectly to make sure that it's never exposed to the police officers, he believed that confessing his crime to the police officers was the best idea, thus proving that he believes being caged up in his own mind due to the overwhelming guilt is much better than being caged up in a cell. All in all, I believe the fear of being discovered acts as the main catalyst that impacted the narrator. Overwhelmed by fear and guilt, he loses control of thinking rationally and confesses to his crime. This shows that the fear of being discovered can consume a person and definitely lead to their downfall. Thank you.
Well, I totally agree with speaker number 4's perspective, and I firmly believe that the key and primary reason why the narrator confesses his murder is due to his fear of being discovered. It forces an immediate action and creates a fight or flight situation where the narrator feels burdened as he is bottling up all the guilt, fear, and his wrongdoings at the same time. Therefore, it reaches to a breaking point where he needs to expose himself and confess in order to feel relieved and have a sense of realization of his act and his immoral act. Therefore, I think that fear of being discovered is the main reason why the narrator confessed his murder. Thank you.
As a conclusion, I believe fear of being discovered is the stronger reason why the narrator finally confesses. He becomes so afraid that the police officer will find out the truth that he starts to panic. His fear affects his thinking, making him believe the police officers already know he is guilty. In the end, he cannot handle the fear anymore and admits to the murder. So, what do you guys think?
After listening to everyone's opinions, I agree that fear of being discovered is the main reason the narrator finally confesses. This is because the fear of being caught by the police became stronger as the investigation continued. Although the narrator also experienced overwhelming guilt and imagined hearing the old man's heartbeat, these factors increased his fear of being exposed. As a result, he could no longer remain calm and eventually admitted to the murder. Therefore, I believe that fear of being discovered is the most convincing reason for the narrator's confession. That's all from us. Thank you.